Welcome back to another episode of Blam Blam Truckers. We're back in the Cybertronian Misadventure, Chapter 8, Leaving Cybertron. Secundus sat in the captain's chair. The ship was repaired. It was far from factory new, but it was functional. There were still a few holes in the hull, but that didn't matter for Cybertronians. Breathing wasn't required for mechanical life forms. Doc assured him it would fly. More importantly, the hyperdrive worked. It would take most of their energon reserves, including what they had scavenged from the Decepticon base in Iacon, but they could escape Cybertron. Almost safe. Almost. Secundus wouldn't feel safe until they were on the new world, a galaxy away from the Decepticons. Finally, the war would be over. Secundus could not even conceive of what that would be like. Peace. He had lived for centuries in peace before the war, and his memories were intact, but he just couldn't fathom it. Secundus had signed up for the war the day after the Magni Rebellion. Him and Grunt. They had lived these last centuries in war. Every decision, every choice they made was tainted with the fear of the Decepticons. What were they planning? How would they respond? Which of his family and friends would be the next ones to be offlined? He had come close to going offline himself the other day. On their last mission, Secundus led a raid on a mausoleum. It wasn't like a fleshling mausoleum. This was a repository of sparks, the processors and spark chambers of fallen Cybertronians, waiting for someone to build them new bodies and bring them back online. They went there to gather sparks to bring as many of the fallen with them to Sanctuary on the New World. It was a raid. No matter how altruistic their intentions, it was still a raid. The bots who designed the place had put in defenses to stop raids. One of those defenses was a fusion cannon that caught Secundus full on the chest. He almost went offline. If Doc hadn't been there to save him, he would have gone offline. Maybe permanently. Maybe that was what was making him so jaded about the imminent flight. Maybe it was centuries of war. Maybe it was the burden of command. Secundus wasn't worried about just himself, but the bots under his command, and now over 10,000 sparks. This is the last hope for Cybertron. One wrong move, one bad decision by Secundus, and Cybertron was doomed. "We're ready for launch, sir." At Forager's cheerful words, Secundus stirred from his dirge. He brought his head up and looked over the bridge of the salvage shuttle. His entire tiny crew was there looking back at him. Forager, the former explorer and geologist, turned into a scout by the war, was in the pilot's seat. Next to him sat Grinder in the co-pilot's seat. Grinder used to be an officer in a space superiority fighter. He was the only one in the crew who had ever piloted through hyperspace, and truth be told, Grinder should have been in command of this former search and rescue team. But he had gone through a tragedy and never really recovered. Secundus had a little empathy for Grinder. Very little. The formerly large bot had a bad attitude and took pride in annoying Secundus and everyone else in the crew. Doc stood at the technician station. The former esoteric scholar turned medical officer had readouts from every ship's system displayed on his console. The smallest bot Secundus had ever met, Doc was also the smartest. Without him, they never would have gotten the shuttle ready. They wouldn't have a world to go to. They wouldn't have a hope of rebuilding the Cybertronian race. And lastly, there was Grunt. Grunt was sitting at the fire control station. There weren't any guns on the ship. Even if there were, there wasn't enough energon to power them. Grunt was useless. Now that wasn't fair. Grunt was strong and loyal, and the only survivor from Secundus' original command. Grunt was the closest thing Secundus had left to real family. But on a starship? He was a lousy pilot, and was more likely to break anything worse than ever fix something. Grunt was superfluous, but he was eager to help and was sitting in his seat, eagerly looking at Secundus. They were all eagerly looking at their leader. Secundus quieted all their worries and doubts. "Forget it, Forager," Grinder said with an edge in his voice. "The big bot is daydreaming again." Secundus glared at Grinder. He didn't have a snappy retort at the ready, which would be the appropriate response. He could have exercised military discipline. They were the Autobot army. But that would be an overreaction. So he glowered, letting Grinder feel his disapproval. Grinder didn't show any outward signs of caring. Secundus gave up his glare and answered Forager. All systems are online. As good as they're going to get, sir, Doc answered. That was not Doc's voice, I apologize. As good as they're going to get, sir, Doc answered. That was not the answer Secundus wanted to hear, but it was what he expected. Who circled the ship to make sure we've removed all obstacles? They'd all circled the ships more than once, but he needed to double-check before they put power to the engines. They had literally dug the ship out of the ground after an unexplained earthquake. Any obstruction they hadn't removed could damage the ship, and with it, stop their chances to save themselves and their entire species. I did it, sir, Forager said. All obstructions clear.
Me too, Secundus, Grunt said. It's clear.
Was that a hint of sullenness in his voice? As a strongbot, Grunt did the heavy lifting. He did most of the cleaning of the shuttle. Was he upset Secundus was questioning the job he did? Secundus dismissed the thought. He had the fate of his species on his shoulder. Grunt could handle a little wounded pride. Any final checks we need to do? Secundus asked.
No, sir,
Grinder answered. He had done most of the maintenance Doc had required. Anything I'm missing? Secundus asked. When there was no answer, he followed up with anybody. We only get one shot at this. It was Doc who finally answered. No, sir. We've triple and quadruple checked. We are as ready as we'll ever be. Secundus did not find Doc's answer reassuring. All right. Forager, bring power to the engines. Take us up when you're ready. For one of the most important moments in the history of Cybertron, it wasn't a very iconic line. His crew didn't seem to care. Doc shifted his head down to scan his console. Forager flipped a few switches, starting the low hum of energon and electronics, and put his hands on the yoke. Grinder was bent over his yoke, making adjustments to the flight computer, and seemed to be doing most of the work. Even Grunt, sitting at a fire control console for a ship with no guns, was focused on his assigned duties, pointless as they were. Ship lurched off the ground. Secundus was filled with the terror of his realization of his dreams suddenly becoming real. A second ago, all his problems were theoretical. In that instance, they became all too real. Now they had to get the ship out of Cybertron's atmosphere, clear orbit, and calculate a hyperspace jump without an astrocomputer to a system no one had been to in over a millennium. Was it 2 millennia? Since long before the war. Doc had only told him the name of the scout who had found the world. Jetfire or Skyfire or something? A veteran from the first war with Nebulos, and that was long before the current Civil War. After the Nebulous War, Skyfire became a scout and got lost on the edge of the galaxy. And Doc remembered it like it was yesterday. Secundus couldn't do that. But after all this time working with Doc, he trusted the tiny bot. Immediately after they jerked off the ground, Secundus watched as Grinder grabbed his yoke, and suddenly their flight got much smoother, as Forager and Grinder shared the controls. They didn't say anything to each other, didn't even look at each other, but they worked well together. The flight grew uneventful. The feeling of motion, of steady acceleration, grew normal. It should have been calming. It didn't stop Secundus from worrying the entire time. Probably nothing would be able to stop him worrying.
We're at 1,000 feet,
Grinder said. His voice was calm and neutral. It was probably the first time Secundus had ever heard Grinder not have an edge in his voice.
Stabilizers are working, ready to engage thrusters.
Cybertronian technology often seemed to defy physics. Even on their low reserves of energon, they had enough power to effectively hover at 1,000 feet in the air before engaging the main thrust engines and accelerating out of the atmosphere. It should have been the pilot, Forager, calling this out, not the co-pilot, but it was what it was.
Proceed,
Secundus replied. They engaged the main atmospheric engines, jerking forward, then adjusting to the new acceleration. Everyone was silent except for Grinder. Every few minutes he was calling out their altitude in increments of 500 feet. Every altimeter reading should have put Secundus more at ease. It meant they were getting closer to their goal. Instead, it was increasing his anxiety.
6,000 feet.
Something was going to happen. It had to happen. There weren't many Cybertronians left in the galaxy. Weren't many left on Cybertron, Autobots or Decepticons. And over the last weeks, Secundus' crew had offlined another dozen odd Decepticons. Even so, They wouldn't let the Autobots leave unmolested. Not in Secundus' experience. Something had to be coming.
6,500 feet.
What could they be planning? As far as Secundus knew, there were only Seekers left. Viacons, Decepticons created only for battle. They were deadly warriors, but they weren't great planners, and they were always aching for a fight.
7,000 feet.
Maybe they'd be safe when they broke atmosphere. Maybe then they would have enough of a lead so the Decepticons couldn't catch them. My Primus, let the Decepticons not catch them. Into the silence, Grunt spoke, interrupting Secundus' reverie.
My guns don't work.
Not now, Grunt. Secundus' dismissal rang out harshly.
But sir,
Grunt protested.
My guns don't work. Not now!
Secundus' voice was a growl. It was all he could do to keep from yelling at the strong bot.
I'm fire control. I need my guns.
Secundus almost yelled it, but Doc intervened, calm as ever. There are no guns on the shuttle, Grunt. We used those parts to fix up the shuttle.
Then how am I supposed to shoot the Decepticons?
Grunt asked. Every head in the shuttle turned to look at Grunt. Decepticons?
Decepticons?
Secundus demanded. Grunt pointed at his fire control console.
There's something on the radar. Autobots are waiting out the Decepticons.
That was true. When Secundus tried to reach the other Autobot groups he knew about to offer them a chance to come with them, well, he hadn't gotten a response from any of them. Secundus did not take that as a good sign. Grunt was right. Those blips on the radar were probably Decepticons. Bring it up on screen. Grunt bent down to his console and fumbled a bit. It was Grinder who brought the radar up on the big screen. He did it quickly and efficiently, and always kept one hand on the yoke. Excuse me. Unicron's blood, Secundus cursed. Are there 12 of them? That's 12, sir. Forager didn't quite keep his voice from breaking. Looks like the standard Seeker Starfighter chassis, Doc added. We are dead! We are dead. Forager was whispering, but in the silence of the bridge they could all hear him.
Can we outrun them?
Secundus asked. No, Doc said. His voice sounded more solemn than calm.
Can we make it out of the atmosphere before they reach us?
Secundus asked. They needed to clear atmosphere before they could jump to hyperspace. We're a little over 7,000 feet up, Doc said. The safest place to jump from is over 100 miles up.
And this rust bucket was never built for speed,
Grinder growled. He leaned over his console, trying to eke some more speed out of the thrusters. Secundus sighed.
Then we gotta take them down.
A dozen Seekers? We're as good as dead! Forager exclaimed.
Belay that!
Secundus growled. Forager was right. But if they died, then all hope for Cybertron died with them. They had to try. Grunt, Grinder, you're with me. Doc, Forager, keep us flying. As soon as we break Atmo, I want you to jump, whether we're back or not. But, Forager started to say, but Doc cut him off. Understood, sir. Grinder shook his head. It was his plan. The same plan he had in Iacon. Grunt would act as a distraction and Grinder would take out the Seekers. Only this time Grunt couldn't do his dance of dodge, and Secundus was there to provide additional firepower. If only the boss was a better shot, they might have a chance. As it stood, they were banking on the Seekers being decent shots and Grunt's chassis being tougher than the shuttle's hull. There was no way around it. This sucked. Grinder was in the starboard airlock. Secundus was in the port airlock. Grunt was lashed to the hull. In Grinder's experience, Seekers like to destroy Autobots more than they like to shoot up shuttles. The whole plan was banking on them shooting Grunt rather than the ship. This absolutely sucked. Cybertronians weren't just terrestrial creatures. They existed in space, too. So it was standard for all Cybertronians to have some minor control over their personal magnetic field. It wasn't particularly powerful. The ability was used to let them hull walk on spaceships or space stations. If they were separated from a ship, they could slowly pull themselves back to the ship by increasing their magnetic field. It wasn't true flight. Yes, some Cybertronians outfitted themselves with thrusters and could fly through space, but all Cybertronians could move through space. Grunt could hold on to the hull with his magnetic ability. They all could, but that ability was built for relatively immobile ships or stations in the vacuum of space, not a shuttle hurtling through atmosphere. A sharp turn could knock him off the hull, and strong as he was, Grunt probably couldn't survive a fall from 7,000 feet. So he was lashed to the hull. It was two heavy wires, cables, really, one wrapped around each foot. Far from ideal, but it was their only hope. This just sucked, but it was what it was. Grinder did not feel good about using Grunt as bait. Bait that they actually wanted the enemy to shoot. Not shoot at, but shoot. Grunt was tough. Grinder had seen him shrug off some serious damage before, but if he lost Grunt, even if it saved Cybertron, Grinder wasn't sure he could live with himself. The cost of this war was already too high. He couldn't lose his friend. The only comfort Grinder had was that if Grunt died, they would probably all die. And if they all died, then Cybertron died with them. Grinder smiled to himself. It should not have comforted him, but it did. But then Grinder had been through a lot, more than most, and he had a dark sense of humor. Not just humor. He had a dark sense of reality. The Seekers are almost within range. That was Forager's voice over the internal AM radios. Grinder acknowledged by making a click sound over the radio. On the hull, Grunt would be standing up, using the magnets on his feet to keep them on the hull, drawing his ion pistol out of payload and aiming at the Seekers. Grinder was easing out of the airlock, exposing just his fusion cannon and enough of himself to get a visual to start aiming up a shot. He couldn't wait this time. An Iacon, he had waited for the Seekers to get within short range and taken out 4 of them in his opening volley. But an Iacon, he wasn't on a rickety, half-repaired shuttle that could easily be shot out of the sky. Grunt had been able to dodge. This time he couldn't. An Iacon, they had time. Now they didn't. What he could wait for was Grunt to take the first shot. His fusion cannon had a longer range than Grunt's ion pistol. The Decepticons were flying in a roughly V-shaped pattern. Grunt's job was to get their attention. Grunt would shoot at the closest Seeker, the one in the middle, as soon as it got within range. Maximum range for the ion pistol was medium range for his fusion cannon. That would let Grinder take aim on the farthest Seeker, the one at the end of the V, then work his way up the line. An Iacon, he had taken out 4 of the Seekers in his first volley. With a bit of luck, he could repeat that here. "Doc," Grinder whispered over the AM radio. He didn't have to whisper. The enemy couldn't hear his broadcast, but habits are habits. "Keep us updated on the radar. Grunt, first shot is yours. The lieutenant and I will hold fire until you shoot."
Got it, Grinder,
Grunt said back. There was tension in his voice. "Understood," Doc said, calm as ever. Grinder stopped breathing. They were robotic life forms. They didn't need to breathe. They usually did breathe. The exchange of gases facilitated a number of processes in their Cybertronian bodies, but breathing wasn't necessary, and it hindered his aiming. So Grinder made the conscious decision to stop. And all the noise, the wind whipping past them, the roar of the engines, it all faded away. Grinder was left with just the sights on his fusion cannon, his optic sensors focused on the farthest Decepticon on the starboard side. He wasn't focused on Grunt taking that first shot, but he was aware of it. He waited for a few tenths of a second to see how the Seekers reacted. If they juked or changed formation, he would have to react accordingly. They didn't. So he started his own barrage. He fired on the last Decepticon, then aimed to the next to last, fired, aimed on the next, fired, and worked his way up the line. He didn't wait to see if his shots hit or what the Decepticons did in response. He didn't have time. Grinder got off 5 aimed shots against 5 moving targets in about 5 seconds. He shifted his gaze off his sights and reevaluated. The situation hadn't changed much. 2 of his initial targets were gone. Either they were damaged enough to not be able to keep up or he had offlined them. It really didn't matter which. Of the 3 remaining, 2 were loosing smoke. They weren't juking yet. Grinder didn't waste time congratulating himself. He had a job to do. He was back on his fusion cannon sights and repeating the process, aiming shots on the farthest one out and working inward. He did 4 targets this time, moving up the line to a Decepticon he hadn't shot at in the first volley. Reevaluate. 4 shots. 4 fighters falling behind and out of range. How damaged they were didn't matter. They were out of combat for now. But Grinder was out of targets. He needed to reposition himself out of the airlock to aim at the rest of the Seekers. He started to breathe again. He could feel the wind rushing past him, hear the roar of the engines, and most of all, the sound of Grunt's ion pistol being fired wildly. He grabbed a magnetic tow line from the airlock stanchion and attached it to his back. Keeping his fusion cannon in his right hand, he clambered out onto the hull, magnetizing his feet to hold on. He moved slowly, trying to get a glimpse of the enemy before they spotted him. Sit rep, Doc, Grinder asked in a whisper as he climbed up the hull. 6 of the Seekers have fallen back, but are still on radar. 1 has gone from radar. So 5 are left in the fight? Grinder asked as he reached the edge of the top of the shuttle and started easing over it. Please let Grunt still be online. Please let Grunt still be online. I think so. I never read a radar before, but I always meant to learn. For once, Grinder could detect a hint of stress in Doc's voice. 3 of the Seekers had transformed and landed on the shuttle. They were standing at range and blasting fire at Grunt. 2 others were off to port, still in jet mode, and firing at the port airlock. He didn't think they saw him yet. They hadn't attacked him yet. Secundus, Grinder called over the AM radio. Sit rep. Grinder aimed up at the con on the shuttle that was farthest from Grunt. He fired off 2 shots in quick succession and dropped back down behind the edge of the ship. Laser fire poured over the edge where he had positioned himself. Something just fell away from the ship, Doc called out over the radio. Grinder heard the sound of ion fire. It was different enough from laser fire for him to tell the difference. He didn't know what was going on up there, but if he had to guess, the 2 remaining Seekers on the hull had both started shooting at Grinder. That meant they had stopped shooting at Grunt. If he was right, that was a mistake, and Grunt was showing them the error of their ways. Grinder had moved about 30 feet away from where he had first popped up to shoot. He eased up over the edge of the shuttle again. His world went black. They were going to die. Secundus was sure of it. They were going to die, and with them all hope for Cybertron. Who knows? Maybe Optimus would come back in the next split second. At this point, Secundus would be happy to see that demented Dinobot Grimlock. Short of some divine intervention, Secundus just didn't see a way out of this. In the initial sortie, he had bullseyed one of the Seekers. It had been a perfect shot. While he was aiming up his second shot, the Seekers opened fire on him. Secundus had tried to get another shot off, but every time he leaned out of the cover, he took another hit. He was functioning, but wounded. Secundus was hurt and barely returning fire. That didn't stop the Decepticons from keeping up a steady barrage of cover fire. 12 Seekers. There weren't supposed to be that many Decepticons in the area, not after they destroyed the base at Iacon. Secundus hadn't seen this coming. No one had. Not that it mattered. Reality was what mattered, not what he thought it should be. And reality was they were all about to be offline. Sit ret, Doc? Heh. At least Grinder was still alive. That was good news. 6 of the Seekers have fallen back but are still on radar. 1 has gone from radar. Wait. What did Doc just say? 6 and 1? Grinder and Grunt had managed to offline 6 Seekers, and his 1 made 7? That meant there were only 5 left. That meant there was a chance. There was a chance! Another volley of lasers shot across the airlock. Secundus was a Class 3. He stood over 40 feet tall and was above average strength for his size. Hurt or not, he could take another hit or 2. Attaching a safety line to his back, he waited for this laser volley to end, then popped around the side of the airlock and fired off a few poorly aimed shots of his own. He pulled himself back in quickly, lasers flashing past the airlock. There were only 2 jet planes out there shooting at him. That was good news. Secundus might have even hit one. He ducked out again after the next volley and aimed it this time, hitting one of the jets right in the nose cone. As he wrenched himself back in, he took a hit on his leg. He staggered and almost fell, but somehow, between leaning against the wall and shifting his weight to his good foot, Secundus managed to stay upright. He was aware of Grinder asking for a sit rep. He needed a minute before he could talk. Doc called out something had fallen away from the ship. Secundus smiled. That left 4. 4 on 3. Somehow they had almost evened the odds. No time to celebrate. They still had to survive this. He tentatively put some weight on the bad foot. It hurt, but he could walk on it. He double-checked to make sure his safety line was still attached, and then leaned out the airlock. Both of the Seekers that had been shooting at him were attempting to dodge blue-white energy bolts. Ion fire! Grunt was shooting at his targets. He was even hitting them sometimes. They couldn't angle up to shoot at Grunt without losing speed relative to the shuttle. Enough of that. Secundus brought up his rifle and took a well-aimed shot at the jet he had just hit in the nose cone. It didn't explode, but he could see some damage and smoke. He aimed up on the other Seeker and fired. It took some damage too. Shots from Grunt's ion pistol impacted. Lightning crackled over both Seekers' hulls. Both Seekers' hulls. Neither jet exploded, but both of their engines cut out. Soon they would be out of range. Secundus climbed out of the airlock onto the hull of the shuttle. He was moving as fast as he could. Injured as he was, that wasn't very fast. Excuse me. When he got to the top, he saw Grunt and two Seekers in bot form. One of the Seekers was keeping up a steady stream of laser fire at Grunt. The other was focused on Grinder's side of the shuttle, as if he was looking for a target. Most of the shots being aimed at Grunt were hitting the strong bot. Grinder was still standing. If it was Secundus taking those shots, he would have been taken offline by now, but Grunt was still standing, his hands up over his face like a boxer. Secundus aimed up on the Seeker that wasn't shooting and hit him square in the chest. The bot was knocked off the shuttle and falling fast. The other Seeker started firing at Secundus. The Class 3 took a hit and got knocked off the shuttle. So this was it. This was how he was going to die. Falling to Cybertron while he trying to escape a Decepticon attack. Fine. As long as the others made it, then Secundus could go offline. He felt secure, like a weight had been lifting off his shoulders. He had done all he could. He was snapped back to reality by the safety line. Secundus sighed. It was back to the battle. If he could climb the safety line, back to the shuttle. I'm going to take a sip of water before I keep going, guys. Grunt roared and charged. Seeing the Seeker shoot Secundus snapped something inside of Grunt. Grinder was already dangling from his safety line and not moving. Losing the boss was too much. He forgot about the cables on his feet that had him lashed to the ship. A normal bot would have fallen flat on their face. Grunt snapped his chains like they were nothing. He ran through the last Seeker, shattering the con into pieces. Let me just fix that. Maybe I wanted to say into a million pieces, but I think that's too graphic. There was no coming back from that. So let's do that whole line. He ran through the last Seeker, shattering the con into pieces. There was no coming back from that. There was no way to slow down before he ran out of shuttle either. Grunt was hurtling through the air. There was no safety line to pull him back to the ship. Grunt wasn't going to die. He was prepared for this. Cybertronians didn't wear clothes like fleshlings, but they carried gear incorporated into their bodies. They could get integrated weaponry, integrated tools, or just store gear in compartments. They called the stored gear payload. Grunt had the same integrated tools he had from before the war, back when he was shipping cargo in his alt form on fleshling worlds and learning martial arts from the fleshlings. After he almost ran out of energon on a hostile planet, he added not one, but 3 solar ports. After his gravity repulsors failed during an oceanic transport, he added an interior vacuum tube so he could float on water. After a bad thunderstorm, he had a tool slot removed to add protection against electricity. And after a bad fall, Grunt added in a parachute. He would be able to deploy it when he was low enough and land safely back on Cybertron. There was no way back to the shuttle. He waved goodbye to his friends, the only family he had left, and got ready for landing. It would be lonely waiting for them to come back, but what was a few centuries to a Cybertronian? They were going to get away from the planet, and they'd find the new world Doc had talked about. He would see them again one day. They would come back with all the offline sparks they saved from Iacon. They'd all have these new amazing bodies that Doc made for them, and Grunt would get to see his family again. It was worth it. Might as well get ready for landing. Grunt oriented Grunt oriented himself so his feet were facing the ground. He put his ion pistol back into his payload. He blinked. There's something else in his payload. There couldn't be anything in his payload because he cleared it out so he could fit in the jetpack he found on the shuttle. The jetpack! Cybertronians interface with technology differently than fleshlings. He didn't strap the jetpack on as much as his body shifted the jetpack into position, incorporating it as part of himself. He aimed at the shuttle and gave a short burst of thrust. Certain he was doing it right. He had barely ever used a jetpack before and was far from being an expert. Grunt gave a full burn. He wasn't catching up to the shuttle, but it wasn't outpacing him either. He needed help.
Forager, I need you to come get me, he said over the AM radio.
Grunt, what is happening out there? Forager demanded.
I fell a little.
A little? How do you fall a little off a shuttle? Forager asked.
I can see him, Secundus said, breaking into the conversation. Grunt's using a jetpack. Go get him, Forager. That's an order.
Who's going to fly the shuttle? Forager asked.
Doc can keep it flying straight for a few minutes. Go. We don't have much fuel. We don't know how much fuel that jetpack has.
Grunt had filled up the jetpack full of energon. He had to use his own energon to do it. He had 3 solar ports. He was always full of energon and could afford to fuel the jetpack. A full jetpack was about 8 minutes of flight time. Not a lot, but they weren't designed for continual use. Jetpacks were built to do work outside of a craft while in space. It should be enough. If not, well, there was always the parachute. It took Forager less than a minute to come running out of the starboard airlock. He jumped in the air and transformed into his plane mode. Grinder doesn't look good, boss, Forager said as he made a wide arc so he could be facing toward the shuttle when he got within range of Grunt.
I'm not doing so hot myself, Secundus said, but the Decepticons are retreating. We'll have time to deal with it after we get Grunt back on the ship.
Secundus was right. For his part, Grunt kept the jetpack on full thrust, and he was hoping it all worked out. He was hoping real hard. It seemed like an eternity to Grunt, but finally Forager was in position. The flyer released his cargo winch, and it snaked out behind him. When it got close enough, Grunt reached out his hand and grabbed it.
Got it, Grunt said.
Keep that jetpack on, Forager said, and hold on tight. Oh, excuse me. Forager moved up to full speed, and the 2 Autobots began to catch up to the shuttle. The minutes ticked by, and just as the jetpack was starting to sputter, Grunt was able to let go of the tow cable and land on the shuttle, holding on with his magnetics. As soon as Grunt let go of Forager, the flyer shot past the shuttle. He was already cutting speed and angling around for a landing when Grunt spoke.
I'm good.
Doc let out a cheer over the air. Get back in here, Forager. I don't know what I'm doing. You never learned to fly, Doc? Forager asked. I meant to, but I never got around to it. Get in here. Grunt stood up. He could see Grinder if he looked one way, and Secundus if he looked the other. Grinder was still dangling from his safety line. Secundus was slowly climbing his safety line.
Grunt, get to the airlock and pull me in.
Secundus was giving orders again. Then you can do the same for Grinder.
But Grinder's hurt, Lieutenant, Grunt replied.
He's probably offline. Hopefully Doc can get him online. But first, I need to get back to the bridge and take over for Doc so he can take a look at Grinder.
Right. Good. Coming.
Grunt needed things explained to him sometimes. Secundus was good at explaining things. Time for another little sippy sip. Ooh, little sippy sip. Yes. It was over an hour later when Secundus announced over the AM radio, "We've officially broken atmosphere, docked to the bridge for hyperspace calculations." Looks like I have to go, Doc said aloud. Grinder didn't give any outward physical sign of acknowledgement. There was still a large hole in his head and dents all along his body where he'd banged against the shuttle's hull.
And leave me like this?
You're back online and stable, Doc said with his usual pleasant bedside manner. There's not much more I can do for you without parts, which I used up getting you back online. You're going to have to heal naturally. With enough energon, everything will grow back. He didn't say eventually. He didn't have to. With enough energon and time, his living metal body would repair itself. Energon was in short supply. They only had 6 almost full cubes to fuel this trek to a new world. They had tapped 2 cubes to get the equivalent of 1 full cube to get them out of atmosphere. The hyperspace journey was expected to take up another 3 cubes, and the landing on the new world would take up the rest. Luckily, all 5 Autobots had solar ports. They produced energon just by being in starlight. With enough time, Grinder would heal, assuming he didn't expend any excess energon.
Got it, Doc. I'm on bed rest for a while.
Grinder sighed. Doc could tell he was in an especially foul mood. Doc shook his head. Normally he wouldn't say what he was about to say. If it helps, and it shouldn't, except for the hole in your head, Secundus is in far worse shape than you are right now. Grinder snorted. Then he snorted again, a bit louder. Then he chuckled.
Stop it, Doc. It hurts to laugh.
Yeah, he took so many laser hits he can't even transform. Grinder gave a full belly laugh.
Ouch. I told you, it hurts to laugh.
Doc smiled despite himself. He didn't care for Grinder reveling in Secundus' misery. He didn't like seeing his patient and friend, but he did like seeing his patient and friend feeling better. Just take it easy. I have to head up to the bridge.
Sir, yes, sir.
And that's it for Chapter 8. Chapter 8 was going to end this back when I was writing these for part of an RPG, or lead into an RPG. I wasn't even sure if I was going to do Chapter 8, but then I came up with a new idea, so I wrote Chapter 9, and I may even write a Chapter 10. I haven't decided yet. But that's the whole thing. We've been going for 36 minutes, so I'm just going to say thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and keep on trucking, you blam blam truckers.